Hello, my name is Dan Buttry, and I'm the co-author of this new book, Healing the World, Gustavo Parajón, Peacemaking and Public Health Pioneer. You know, back in the 1980s, I was pastor of a church in Boston, and I got arrested during public demonstrations against the U.S. policies toward Nicaragua. There was a big war going on there between the revolutionary government, led by the group known as the Sandinistas, and the U.S. supported Contras. Many of them were the leftovers from the National Guard under the dictatorship of Somoza. When Somoza was overthrown in the revolution, these members of the National Guard fled and they started up a counter-revolution, and the U.S. supported them. There were many, many human rights abuses that were going on, and so many of us, especially in the religious communities, joined what was called the Pledge of Resistance, where we said that we would take acts of civil disobedience. We would risk arrest, we would get arrested if need be, to protest what the U.S. policies were, to stand in the way of what the U.S. was trying to do against the country of Nicaragua. I had no idea who Gustavo Parajón was, had never heard of him. And so later on I found out that my getting arrested was directly linked to a phone call that Gustavo Parajón made. So let me tell you that story that I didn't know until I was busy writing this book. And I interviewed somebody who told me a part of the story that affected my life that I didn't know about. So the religious peacemaking community, groups like Sojourners Fellowship of Reconciliation, the Baptist Peace Fellowship, many, many other organizations for peace, Christian groups, Jewish groups, there were even some Muslim groups at some point that joined some of these peace organizations. And they were standing together in various ways of protest, but using a lot of the means of writing letters to Congress, sometimes demonstrating, and so on. They were having a retreat up at Kirk Ridge Retreat Center in Pennsylvania, something they did every year to share what they were doing and so on. And a call came in from Nicaragua, from Gustavo Parajón. Gustavo had worked with some of the groups, including a group called Witness for Peace, that was taking people down to Nicaragua to see what was happening so that they could make up their own minds and then try to have some sort of impact back in the U.S. on the basis of what they had seen and heard. And Gustavo Parajón was the point person in Nicaragua for working with all these organizations. Well, Gustavo called at the retreat, and it was Jim Wallace who answered the phone. And Jim Wallace at the time was the editor of Sojourners magazine. And Gustavo called up and said, we have very good intelligence that the U.S. is planning to invade Nicaragua very soon. And you need to do something. And Jim said, well, you know, what do you want me to do? And he said, well, God told me that I should call you. And Jim said, well, did God tell you what we should do? And he said, no, God didn't tell us what you should do. God told me to call you and let you know what's going on and that you will figure out what you need to do. And so that's the way it was. Jim came back to the group, shared what Gustavo had said, and as they were starting to kind of look at all the typical things, those peacemakers realized they had to, as we say in sports, up their game. They had to increase what they were doing, get outside the box of traditional peacemaking activities. And so they developed what was called the Pledge of Resistance, where through all these peace organizations networks, they had this pledge that if the U.S. would invade, the signatories would commit acts of civil disobedience or stand in support of those who are committing the civil disobedience and risking arrest. We had over 30,000 people, including me and another guy in our church, who committed ourselves to getting arrested if the U.S. engaged in an invasion of Nicaragua. We learned later that the threat of all this massive arrest across the country actually impacted U.S. policy, and they decided not to invade, but instead to provide more funding to the Contras. So we shifted, when it was clear that the invasion wasn't going to take place, we shifted to protest against Congress sending more aid to the Contras. And when a vote came before the Congress, we launched the Pledge of Resistance, or activated it, and I was one of 586 people who occupied the federal building in downtown Boston, and along with my the Scott, who was in our peacemakers group at my church, and other members of our church peacemakers group were outside the building supporting us, holding signs and so on, and we occupied the federal building, and eventually we all got arrested. It was part of mass arrests where thousands and thousands of people all across the country were arrested in protest of U.S. policies. And it was that phone call from Gustavo to people that he had come to know as they came down to Nicaragua to see. He had called them and challenged them to do more in the efforts of peacemaking. And I was one of those who got that challenge and got arrested. And so thank you, Gustavo, for the inspiration that caused me to do something dramatic in my life as a witness for peace. And so that story is not told in terms of me, but it's told in terms of what Gustavo did and the impact with the U.S. peacemaking organizations in this book, Healing the World, Gustavo Parajón, Peacemaking and Public Health Pioneer. This book will be available in all the major booksellers on January 24th. You can pre-order it now, and if it's after January 24th, of course, you can get it. It'll be available in hard copy, paperback, and ebooks. And so I encourage you, just like Gustavo changed my life, even if you don't know about him, reading his story might inspire and change your life. Thank you very much.